My name's Morley. I'm a model maker who's worked in films. I grew up in the 1960s, arguably one of the golden ages of miniature effects. And as a kid, I used to watch TV shows like Thunderbirds and Captain Scarlet. And I decided that at the age of 10, that if there was one thing I wanted to do with my life, it was to build miniature worlds and blow them up. Sadly, my father, the famous photographer, decided to move our entire family to Australia in the early 70s. So it looked very unlikely that I'd be able to actually fulfill that dream. So I studied interior design at college because that was the course with the most model making, and started work as an architectural model maker. After about a year, I discovered a small firm that actually produced props, special effects, and costumes for the television commercial industry. So I started there. After about a year, I went freelance and started very slowly to get into the Australian film industry.
The first concept I had of the Dark City in space was a Patrick Totopoulos illustration, and I seem to recall making a model from foam core to get an idea of how big the filming model should be. Once that was designed, the steel department made a conical structure with a flat top, which had opal perspex laid over the top of it, and I then built the miniature buildings to fit onto that with the spiral effects of the streets based on art department drawings. I was wondering how the heck I was going to make all these buildings until I was looking through George Niddle's amazing reference library, and I came across a book of New York rooftops. And looking at these aerial views of buildings, it suddenly struck me that what you were really seeing was the detailed rooftops, and that the sides of the buildings were really not very important. So I decided to use timber run through a circular saw with the blade set very low to provide grooves on the sides of the timber, and I then cut those to height, and I made a series of small rooftop detailed sections using plastic parts, and ran silicon molds and cast them in urethane to provide a variety of rooftop sections, which I then glued onto the tops of the timber buildings that I'd made and laid them out in spirals. The gaps between the buildings were meant to be canals of some sort, so they were painted black so that the buildings, which were a light grey, would show up better. In the long shots, I ended up cutting a series of tiny little chips of front projection material and placing them all over the buildings so that when you shot the scene with a piece of glass at 45 degrees to the camera, you could shine light into it and that would reflect onto the model and kick back, which would give the impression that the lights were on in the buildings. I was basically responsible for building the upper city. The underside of the city was constructed by Tom Davies and other members of his model team while I was off doing other stuff. Originally, one of the Patrick Totopoulos concepts had a huge mechanical looking spider clasped around the base of the city, and I ended up making a concept model of that was scaled to the size of the city that we were building so that we could put it alongside and see what it looked like. But once we'd actually done that, it was decided that it really didn't add anything to the look of the city. Interestingly, Dark City is one of the early films in the Australian film industry where there was a welding between miniature photography and CG effects. So, as well as the actual physical model that I built, there was a fully modeled and rendered CG version of the city, which allowed them to do things like the shot from space, where you see the light reflecting on the rivers as the city is turned over to face the sun. Structures were actually reproduced as a larger section that we shot separately motion control. There was a brick wall on one of the buildings with a tiny hole in it, probably only about half an inch high, and the motion control system zoomed in onto this tiny hole, and live action footage of William Hurt was then inserted into that final scene. The miniature trains for Dark City were a group effort. They were scratch built over existing, I think it was O-scale bogies. The finished trains that were made out of wood and cardboard were towed along the rail lines using a piece of fishing line. The side sections were made as an assembly line process with a couple of model makers. I remember making the front section of the train out of balsa wood. The light up the top was a mag light so that it would have a nice bright shiny effect when it was pulled through the miniature set. It's kind of interesting that nowadays with chip on base LED light units, the amount of light that you can put out and put into a miniature is quite amazing compared with what we were doing in the late 90s. One of the largest miniatures on Dark City was the water tower. The reason for the building being this big was simply that with water, it's notoriously difficult to scale. So therefore you have to have a miniature as big as possible to ensure that the water that's filmed looks reasonably realistic. The building that the water tower stands on is about 3 meters tall, and the tower and water tank above that are about another 3 to 4 meters high. It was basically a steel understructure with MDF paneling detailed with walls and bricks by the model department, and the actual water tank itself was a fiberglass sphere that was filled with about 1,000 litres of water in it. It was shot outside at night in a parking lot in Sydney's suburbs. It was wired up with det cord so that when it was exploded, it would split and allow the water to cascade out. We had to paint the tank in brown acrylic paint. Then Tom Davies suggested the detail of using split peas glued over it in lines to represent rivets, which gave it an extra texture. We found that the dew was starting to fall. Sticking rivets onto something that was actually almost liquid paint was a really very unpleasant situation. It took a lot of hours to rig everything. And then after it was blown, we were exhausted, and Tom immediately sort of said, "Okay, now we start on the backup." And everyone in the model department sort of rolled their eyes skywards with the thought of another 10 hours of hard work. But the camera department came back and said, "No, we got it first time." So everyone was happy all around on that one. I should actually just mention at this point that one of Tom's innovations for the miniatures of Dark City was to play with the way that light actually worked on the miniatures and breaking up the surfaces as much as possible. So he would streak the buildings with shellac, which would not only give them a shiny effect, but would also be an uneven shine so that it would tend to break things down. And then to break up that sort of shininess even more, he'd sprinkle tea leaves on them. So the actual filming miniatures were kind of bizarre if you saw them in real life, because they were painted up in realistic colours, but with an overwash of deep yellow and tea leaves sprinkled all over them. The Shell Beach sign with its animated arm waving up and down was a very nice piece of production design. We had to build it at about 1:20 scale with a little stepper motor behind the billboard with a little shaft that poked through to have the arm waving up and down. For the destruction sequences, we ended up building a 1/12 scale miniature of the entire tuning chamber, complete with the face and the clock. The actual face of the stranger's machine, which could split apart to reveal a clock inside, was based on concept art that was developed by George Liddell and Patrick Totopoulos. Tony Lees, who was a sculptor and one of the construction heads, actually built it full size. We ended up having to build a 1/12 scale miniature of that whole set for the destruction sequences at the end. I started building a miniature version of that whole face based very closely on Tony's on-set photographs. Tom didn't sort of think it ultimately looked enough like Tony's original sculpture. And as Tony was clear at that particular point, he came over and sculpted his own 1/12 scale version of it, which I have no problems with because he was the guy who built the original, so there was no one better to do the job than him. It was interesting to actually blow up this miniature, which was designed rather like a cathedral, so that we could have cannons just off to the side of each side, which were sequenced to blow out debris to sort of advance towards the camera. We had a perspex bubble that was pushed up through a miniature version of the street to give the impression that the clock was rising up to the top of the city. Deep inside the Dark City is the tuning machine that the strangers use to actually change reality. One of the things that we had to do was to try and depict this as some sort of miniature. We had a hemisphere molded out of fiberglass, and my partner Marilyn Pride spent a lot of time actually scraping auto putty in rows around the inside of this dome to give the impression that it had been built up in layers. And there were then a series of ladders and walkways running around the circumference of the dome to give the impression it was an absolutely huge space. She then carved this weird shape that looked like a Wellington boot out of polystyrene foam and detailed it to match the rest of the miniature. The tug miniature was a fun little build. The finished item was about 18 inches long, and it was based on a New York style tug, which I simply scaled up using a ruler and calculator, and then built the actual miniature from scratch. Just me working for 2.5 days. So I was really quite pleased with how quickly I got that miniature together. When we got it on set, it was designed to be seen in a sequence at the end of the film after the Dark City has been flooded. And we filmed it, but it never made the final cut. And that's just the way movies go.